kind of the foundation of my research idea here. I wanted to look at what makes memory so prone to error, and how do we create false memories, things like that. And looking into the literature, I found that mood was a big thing that affects memory quite often. And so looking more into it, I wanted to know what about mood is driving errors in memory. And there are kind of two schools of thought on what is driving that error. The first is valence, which is the negative or positive connotation that you associate with a given mood. So sadness, you would say, is a negatively connotated mood. Arousal is the other aspect of mood. It's the physiological response that's associated with mood. And so for a mood like fear, that would be a high arousal emotion. And so now that we have those two pieces, previous literature determined that it was arousal that's really driving that memory error. But there wasn't a clear indication as to the direction. Is it high arousal that's creating false memories and inaccuracies, or is it low arousal? So looking more into how we can induce certain arousal states, there are a ton of different mood induction procedures. They're called MIPs. The two I primarily looked at was video clips and guided imagery and music. Video clips are very strong MIPs in the literature. They seem to be very reliable at inducing given arousal states. And then guided imagery is when you're given a vignette, that's a scenario, this is an example of a sadness one, that you're supposed to imagine while music that is mood congruent is also playing. And this is a very common one that's used in a lot of memory and mood studies. So I wanted to compare these in terms of how good they were at then creating the mood that would then drive the error in memory. And so my theoretical framework for this idea was that if you're in too high of an arousal state or too low of an arousal state, your performance on the memory task will be hindered. And this is based on the Coup utilization theory. And so I'm really trying to use these MIPs to figure out where that medium arousal state is. So my two main objectives, given what we have now established, was I'm directly comparing guided imagery, music, and video clips to figure out which one is the better MIP. And then I'm also examining how that arousal induction will then go on to affect memory accuracy and false memories. So my methodology. I had 6 conditions. This was a completely between subjects design, which just means that everyone was in a different condition. So half of my participants, I used the guided imagery and music mood induction procedure to put them in a given mood, and then half I used video clips. A third of the participants were in a high arousal state, which was the fear condition, or being induced into it. And then a third were in a low arousal condition, which was sadness. And then we had a control condition, which was I wasn't trying to induce any certain state. So my overall procedure here was I gave them a pre-mood assessment questionnaire. I actually gave them 2 so that they could double check on each other. And then I put them straight into the mood induction procedure and then gave them an immediate post-mood assessment questionnaire. Following that, they went into the encoding phase, which is where I had them read 6 word lists with 15 items each. And in between each word list, they were given a recall test where I asked, recall as many words as you can from that list. You have 1 minute, go. So that repeated 6 times. And then I have a 5-minute distractor task, which was just like a 3rd grade level math task, which not everyone was able to complete in 5 minutes. How you will. College students. Anyway, so then they went into the recognition test, which was 48 items. It was all different words, 18 of which were actually in the word list, and the other ones were kind of trying to trick them or just be there to see how they would score. And then I did a second post-test to look at their mood at the very end of the study, and then demographics. And then, of course, I had them consent before any of this. So results. Let's get into it. Okay, so this was one of the mood assessment questionnaires. This one I had them take before, right after, and then at the very end of the study. And unfortunately, the mood induction did not work for any of the conditions. What was significant, however, was the drop in their arousal from the very beginning of the study to the very end, which just means I bored them. I exhausted them. They were not happy with me at all. So then I did also look at the A-grid, which was the second mood assessment questionnaire. This one I only had them take it twice, one right before and one immediately after. This one would have been kind of promising. It shows that when taking the post-assessment, there was a significant difference in arousal. When they were in the fear condition, they had higher arousal than when they were in the sadness condition. And although this looks promising, if you look at the scale here, it's on a 1 to 9 scale, and they're all kind of hugging this 5, 6, so that's like mid arousal levels. So there's not really a significant change there. And also this wasn't corroborated with the BMIS, so no mood induction, sorry. Then moving on to their scores on the recognition test and the recall tests, there were no significant differences in the conditions because they were all kind of in the same mood, same arousal state, due to the MIPs not working. So let's discuss. Yeah, so none of my hypotheses were supported. Mood induction was not successful. I am that. And a couple explanations as to why that might be. Induction, I only gave them 4 minutes for it. While that's definitely not unheard of in previous literature, given that mood was a very important part of my study, could have given it a bit more time, but there are reasons why I didn't. I just won't go into it. Lab setting, what I mean by that is it was a very clinical setting where I was inducing their mood. Fluorescent lights, you know, they're at a table, I'm right next to them. It's really hard to kind of get into a mood state when you've got a lot of distracting, you know, stimuli around you. And so it would be more prudent, probably better in the future if we have them in a dark room, it's quiet, they're really allowed to get into the vignettes, get into the video clips, and go from there. Another problem, the dated materials. So the literature that established that video clips work were based on movies that were, you know, very old, kind of 80s, 90s. Halloween was one of them. I did that. Sorry, I'm sorry, guys.
Really?
I know. You gotta face these. Okay, so anyway. Basically, it wasn't resonating with the younger people in my study, which all the people in my study were young, and so they were like, why are we watching this cheesy film? Everyone knows what happens. So it's dated material. And again, the fact that my sample was all young adults, emotional processing changes with age. And so we don't really get to see how that might have affected the study because I only used young people. So what we do know is I bored them, right? Remember that when I bored them? So we can conclude based on the fact that their recognition accuracy scores were about 80% and their recall or their false recognition was about 20%, which is kind of just average. It's what you would expect. And I had them take the recognition test right at the end, right when they were in that low arousal state. It seems like we can say that low arousal doesn't particularly help or hurt accuracy, but it's limited what we can take away from that. Limitations. I only use young adults, like we said before, that could be a bit of an issue, especially because we don't know how older adults would have reacted, or if it had been different. Would Halloween resonate with them? We don't know. Also, self-report scales. These were the only scales I used for self-report, and so of course you have things like social desirability and bias, but also we ourselves aren't always the best dictators of what our arousal state is at the current moment, consciously. So it would definitely be better in the future to have some kind of physiological measure that might be more accurate when assessing someone's arousal state. And then lastly, I defined high versus low arousal in terms of the change from before they were in the mood induction procedure to after. So the way this can be an issue is, say they come into the test, they say they had an 8 out of 9 high arousal, and then they do the arousal procedure, and they're in the fear condition, so they're meant to have high arousal, and then they take it, they say, okay, it's 9 out of 9. That's only a 1-point increase, even though they're objectively in a higher arousal state. So that can be an issue. It wasn't so much of an issue here because everyone was just kind of mid, but it could be an issue in the future. And then future directions. Given the dated video clips and the fact that a lot of the students said it was cheesy, I couldn't really get into it. It might be time to reassess these video clips and these mood induction procedures in general, because it's from literature that's, not old, but like 15, a couple of years, okay? So I think it would be better to create newer ones, but also more participant active ones, really putting the participant in the front seat and making them accountable for their own arousal state. So, for example, having them do, if we wanted to induce a high arousal state, say, you have 5 minutes, I need you to create a speech on flowers, and I'm going to have people come in and they're going to assess how articulate you are and how good of a presenter you are. Go. And that will freak a lot of people out, probably especially younger people. So that could be a bit of a better procedure for such things. And basically my end message here is that mood is very transient. It's very hard to manipulate in a clinical setting and in a lab setting. And so it's really important that we create strong and reliable ways to induce certain moods, especially if we want to go further into this research. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Andi Kezh, and this is my honors presentation. My thesis is entitled Cleft Curves, Causal Beliefs of Cleft Lip and Palate and Implications in Mexico City, Mexico. There we go. So what exactly is cleft lip and or palate, or CLP as I have abbreviated it for my research? CLP is a birth condition that leaves an unformed hole in the top lip and or the roof or palate of the mouth. And this can lead to complications with eating, breathing, drinking properly, and requires surgery in order to close these holes in your mouth. It occurs in approximately 1 in every 700 births globally. I was actually born with this condition myself. I had my first surgery at 3 months old, and I've had more than 14 surgeries total. I've also had speech therapy, ear tubes, orthodontics, all of the things done. So what causes CLP? Well, there is a fancy term called etiology, which in anthropology and in medicine defines the beliefs on the causes of a disease or an illness. And there are lots of different types of etiology. The one we're most familiar with is called biomedicine, which is rooted in biology and science. So the cause of biomedicine for CLP is nutrition, the environment, and spontaneous genetic mutation that can occur during pregnancy. But there are other believed causes of CLP, including cultural myths, like folklore, religious ideology tied to traditional and historical mythologies, which I'll get more into. And so the CLP condition can cause many problems physically, but also socially and medically. Negative cultural beliefs about CLP can lead to implications like social stigma, low self-esteem, and even health disparities like lack of medical intervention if cross-cultural education is not provided. So looking at the literature, there's actually quite a bit of studies on the cross-cultural beliefs of CLP and implications of the beliefs. For example, studies in India show that holding sharp objects during an eclipse is a believed cause of CLP. Studies in Senegal and Nigeria find that God's will, wicked people, or spiritual, supernatural spirits can be a cause. In China, studies show that rabbit meat during pregnancy is a believed cause of CLP. And there are also implications to this condition. Studies in Uganda and Kenya find that mothers of children with CLP were emotionally distraught and seen as outcasts due to their child's cleft. Studies in South Africa find that traditional healing, like herbal, animal, and plant products, are a believed treatment. And studies in Nigeria find that spiritual cleansing is a believed treatment for this condition. So what I found in the literature is that there is a significant gap of studies on CLP beliefs in the region of Latin America, and specifically in Mexico. So Mexico has the second highest birth rate of clefts in Latin America, right behind Brazil. And there is significant studies on indigenous Mexican beliefs, such as the Nahuatl people, who are said to originate mythical associations of CLP with lunar eclipses and conejo, which is a hare or a rabbit, which I'll get more into. And there are also studies on traditional Mexican healing practices, like curanderismo, which involves wearing amulets or metal crosses underneath your clothing to protect pregnant mothers against a lunar eclipse, which is a believed cause for CLP in cultures. So this leads me to my research question. And so I really hope to use this research to alleviate and address the social and physical burdens that come with the condition, ultimately to improve the lives of those with the condition. And I want to do this through a multicultural perspective, understanding the various cultural systems that might not be spoken about openly but are still really entrenched within these communities. My question is, what are the causal beliefs of CLP? What factors influence these beliefs, and how are these beliefs implicated today in Mexico City, Mexico? So I used convenience sampling for my study. I recruited participants from 3 strategic locations: a speech school in Alivero, Obregón, an orthodontist office in Miguel Hidalgo, and a pediatric clinic in Cuauhtemoc. And these are all in the northern part of Mexico City. I had a sample population of 13 adults ages 18 to 60 in the Cleft community. So what this means is they're either parents of children with clefts or they themselves have a cleft, so they identify with being part of this community. All participants took a written questionnaire, and they also signed an informed consent document. Explanation of the study was given in English and Spanish. I hired a Mexican native translator. She was actually born with a cleft as well, so that really increased the rapport and the trust we had between the participants and the researcher. I also had all of the translations for the questionnaire and the consent forms approved by Dr. Matthew Wild, who's a Spanish professor at Oglethorpe, and the data was kept anonymous to protect the identities of the participants. I also had a partnership with the organization Smile Trade. They're the world's largest cleft charity. They give free surgery and care to cleft patients, and they have partner hospitals and clinics all over the world, including in Mexico City. Here we are at one of the clinics I visited, and we're all wearing our Smile Trade merchandise. I got to interview 2 of the parents that had children at the clinic. I also use a medical anthropology theoretical framework. So medical anthropology is a specialty, examines how human health and well-being are affected by culture, social, and historical factors. I also use theories like grounded theory. So essentially, instead of making a hypothesis and then testing that, instead of making a hypothesis and testing that, I'm actually going to the country, getting my results, and then making a hypothesis and theories, because there have been really no studies there yet, so I don't really have a lot to build off of to form my own hypothesis prior. I also use participatory action research, or PAR, which allows participants to feel that they are advocates in their community, and it allows them to formulate their accounts and their explanations on how to solve an issue within their community. I received ethical approval from Oglethorpe University's Institutional Review Board before I traveled to Mexico City, and I used qualitative content analysis through coding the text of each of their responses to look for key themes. Here's more pictures. This is the pediatric hospital that we visited in Mexico City, and here I am. That's my amazing translator, Claudia. She's from Mexico, and she was also born with a cleft. And here we are with Dr. Garduño, who is a cleft surgeon in Mexico City. So, time for results. As I said, I had 13 participants. 4 were cleft affected themselves, and 9 were parents of cleft affected individuals. 10 of the participants were raised Catholic and or still identify as practicing Catholicism, and 8 participants identify as having a college education level or higher. I did differentiate between internal and external beliefs. So for internal beliefs, their personal beliefs, I found that 10 of the participants indicate biomedical explanations of what causes CLP, so based in biology, like surgery or genetics, family history, all those things. But in terms of external beliefs within the community heard around them, 6 participants say an eclipse of the moon is a believed cause that they've heard, and 4 participants indicate hearing that a mother or parental punishment or blame was the cause of CLP heard in their community. One participant said, some people think that during an eclipse of the moon, the moon can eat the baby. And so this is like a regurgitation of that same literature I found on the indigenous origins of mythological beliefs surrounding CLP, including the role of a lunar eclipse, which can be a cause for CLP that many believe, and also the role of a hare or a rabbit, which is known to eat the lip of a baby inside the womb if a lunar eclipse is occurring. It's really interesting. So terminology was another interesting data point. Many of you might have heard the term hare lip. It is a term that many use for CLP. There is a translation in Spanish, which is labio leporino. But unfortunately, the term hare lip is seen as derogatory and insensitive, mostly because it compares a person to an animal. And also, a hare is seen as a bad omen and a curse in many cultures. And so I found that 9% of my participants prefer the biomedical standard, which in Spanish is labio y paladar hendido, or cleft lip and palate. And that is the biomedical term that they preferred over the traditional term hare lip. One participant wrote hare or leporino comes from the Latin word rabbit, and that's why some people don't like it. So we see that the participants are definitely acknowledging the mythical association with the term, but they are preferring to use a term that I would say is more inclusive based in biomedicine. And then finally, in terms of implications, I did look at social stigma. So I found that 9 of the participants indicate positive social experiences, including parental and family acceptance, though some did mention social stigma like bullying. One participant said he has a special spark, and we think that this was even a gift. So this is a mom of a child with cleft, and I think this is a beautiful quote that illustrates the acceptance and even her finding this condition as a gift. And so it's great to see that progress and acceptance. In terms of medical implications, I found that all 13 participants indicate biomedical treatment, such as surgery, that is necessary. I did find 2 participants mention Mexican mythical beliefs, including the role of curanderismo. So one participant said, there was an eclipse while I was pregnant, and my maid told me to put scissors, basically in a cross, over my stomach. So we're seeing this repetition of curanderismo and the mythical traditional practices, even though it's interesting that all the participants are acknowledging biomedical surgery as well. So to quickly summarize, I did find a difference between internal and external beliefs. Internal beliefs are mostly rooted in biomedicine biology, but external beliefs are reflecting more Mexican mythological explanations. I also found that personal or hereditary connection to CLP can be associated with greater understanding of the biomedical system. What this means is if you have a personal connection to the cleft lip and palate, if you are a parent or you have this condition, you're more likely to understand the biomedical system, the biology, because you are in direct contact with medical professionals, doctors, you know more about it. The terminology for cleft lip and palate is progressing to a more inclusive standard as opposed to a mythological one that is unfortunately derogatory. And positive social experiences were seen by almost all participants, which it displays the acceptance and progress within the community. So to synthesize my findings, I want to leave you all with this quote. It says, medicine was religion, religion was society, and society was medicine. This is a quote from the novel The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's a really great book, I recommend it. It's about an immigrant Vietnamese family who is at an impasse with their American doctors. The Vietnamese family wants to treat their child with cultural, mythological practices. But the American doctors, of course, want to treat the child with biomedicine. And neither are willing to accept one another or come to any sort of conclusion. And this can be a dangerous implication. And this is at the crux of why my research matters, because when you don't acknowledge people's beliefs, we lose patience and we lose the trust of our communities. Many people might assume that biomedicine and cultural mythology are mutually exclusive, but this is not always the case, and there doesn't have to be a necessary binary and opposition between these two. Of course, biomedical systems like surgery are necessary, but what if cultural myths are necessary in their own way for cultural identity and community development? And my study is showing just this. Participants in my study are demonstrating that they can believe the cultural mythology in their community while still acknowledging the biomedical standards simultaneously. And they can do this with little to no negative implications that I found in other studies, like social stigma or lack of medical intervention. And this is really groundbreaking. My findings are suggesting that Clinical professionals, doctors, researchers must acknowledge this medical pluralism and the spectrum of coexisting beliefs that can exist from biomedicine to cultural mythology and traditional practices. And this will allow for professionals like doctors to better communicate with patients and families on health information, public health literacy, and interventions on a multicultural setting. I think we really need to bridge the gap between mythology and medicine, belief systems and medical systems, and between patient and caregiver to provide the most comprehensive care for every individual. Thank you.
All right, so as she said, I am examining the effect of gender and diagnosis label on the stigmatization of individuals on the autism spectrum. So, oops, I'm so sorry. Okay, to start, what is stigma? Stigma is negative stereotypes placed on an individual or a group of individuals for a characteristic that is perceived as different, and it's usually something that they cannot control, and it leads to discrimination and separation of an out-group, which is made up of the stigmatized individuals, and an in-group, which is made up of the rest of society. Stigma can be put towards many different types of out-groups, but today I'm going to be specifically talking about stigma towards individuals with psychiatric disorders. There are four main types of stigma that affect individuals with psychiatric disorders, and those are public stigma, structural stigma, self-stigma, label avoidance, and label avoidance. So public stigma is the stigmatization of these individuals by people in society that they have to interact with or seek services from, such as doctors, teachers, and other professionals. And this is bad because it limits treatment opportunities, and it can also lead to discrimination, which is unfair because these are characteristics that these people cannot control. Structural stigma is kind of similar. I'm sure that many of you have heard of institutionalized racism, and that's an example of structural stigma that comes from things like policies and laws. It can also be unintentional because it's just been built into the society that we live in, and it takes a long time to get rid of. Self-stigma occurs when these individuals that are in the out-group have internalized that stigma, and thus they feel disenfranchised or are less likely to seek out opportunities because they feel that they don't deserve them or feel they won't get them because of their, in my case, diagnosis or psychiatric disorders. And onto label avoidance, it's very related. So once people have internalized that these type of stigmas exist, if they are experiencing symptoms of a stigmatized psychiatric disorder, they may not seek out a diagnosis or treatment because they don't want to have that stigmatized label put on them. And this is bad because stigmatization has been shown to lead to worse treatment outcomes, both psychologically, in behavioral therapies, and in biomedicine as well. And it also leads to discrimination, which is not something that we want in our society. Cool. Okay, so in my study, specifically examined the stigmatization of individuals on the autism spectrum, most specifically with level 1 autism, which is kind of classified as having the lowest amount of support needs. If you guys have heard of Asperger's syndrome, this is an antiquated diagnosis that became outdated in 2013 with the publication of the DSM-5. And if you guys have seen like a movie like Rain Man, that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. It's not a good example, but just to see where you guys are, just to get you guys thinking about the same thing. And there is a little bit of a controversy and disagreement in the literature about whether or not this change in label has led to increased stigma of this group of individuals that were once diagnosed with Asperger's and are now diagnosed with level 1 ASD. Ohan et al. In 2015 found that there was no change in stigmatization. However, Katz in 2019, as well as Smith and Jones in 2019, did find that there was an increase in stigmatization. And so this is a gap in the literature that I hope to resolve. Additionally, there's a major gender bias in autism diagnosis. So the male-to-female ratio in autism diagnosis can range anywhere from 2.7 to 1 and 4 to 1, which is published in the DSM-5. This can be because autism most likely will occur in males, but it can also be because there's gender biases with the diagnosers, in that they have a stereotype that autism is specifically a male disorder, and this has been in the zeitgeist since Asperger's was coined by Hans Asperger in the 1900s. Additionally, there is something called the female autism phenotype that has been in circulation since 1982, and that suggests that because females tend to be socialized to have to take up less space in society, and not be super bothersome or pervasive to others around them, that females with autism are less likely, from an early age, to display their symptoms in a extroverted way. And so, whereas a male child may do repeated motions, or a female child may ruminate mentally over and over and over, which can be misdiagnosed as something like OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and also social communication disorder in specific, which was added in the DSM-5. It's a communication disorder, not a neurodevelopmental disorder. And so many females are misdiagnosed, or rather underdiagnosed with SCD rather than with autism, because especially when they fall under level 1 category, which is bad because females that are or people that are diagnosed with SCD and actually need to be diagnosed with autism do not receive the same support needs with this diagnosis due to like coverage by insurance and things like that. Additionally, gender diverse individuals are 3 to 6 more times as likely to be on the autism spectrum than cisgender individuals. And the intersection of stigma between gender diverse individuals and individuals on the autism spectrum has not been studied before, despite this discrepancy. I'm gonna keep going backwards. Yeah, so as I mentioned, to my knowledge, I'm the first study to include a non-binary vignette character to assess the intersection between the stigmatization of gender diversity and autism. And I'll talk about what vignettes are in just a moment. Additionally, the disagreement in the primary literature about the diagnosis label effect is troubling, and many of the studies on this did not include females, and none of them included gender diverse individuals. And finally, females are only included in autism research 0.46% of the time, which is awful. And this includes research on actual autistic individuals, as well as in vignette studies where you examine a sample of individuals that do not have autism. All right. So as I mentioned, my study utilized a vignette design. This is an example of a vignette or a short story about a character that has that's on the autism spectrum. My vignettes were in the style of an autism diagnosis report or a clinical report that would be given by psychologists in a diagnosis setting, and it listed some demographics as well as the gender of the character, some descriptions of the symptomology and the diagnosis. And there were 9 conditions. I had 2 independent variables. My study was a completely between subjects 3x3 design. So there was all of the conditions had different people. There was 3 levels of my diagnostic label condition variable, which is the level 1 ASD, Asperger's syndrome, and no diagnosis label as a control. And then my gender condition also had 3 levels, which were non-binary, male and female. So as I mentioned, my vignettes were adapted from the first page of summary sections of many level 1 ASD's diagnostic case reports. In the interest of time, I'm only going to go through a few of these, but we can talk after. I also used the attribution questionnaire, or the AQ27, as I'm going to refer to it in the future, to assess the stigmatization that participants felt towards these vignette characters. I also used the Marlowe-Crown social desirability short form to assess the social desirability bias of my sample, or their need for social acceptance, which has been found to be an issue in stigmatization research before, because people are more likely to distort their responses because of their need for social acceptance, especially in sensitive topics like prejudice and mental illness. I also used the novel Autism Stigmatization and Knowledge questionnaire. I included a manipulation check to ensure that they remembered the gender and diagnosis label of the character, and a demographics questionnaire. So my procedure, all of my participants took the survey via this distribution software Qualtrics XM. So it was very standardized across all my participants. I could not control for this time that they took to take the study and the setting that they took the study in. But they all received the same informed consent form, which they had to sign in order to continue with the study. They then were placed in one of those 9 experimental conditions, and they received their experimental vignette first, and then the AQ27. Then they were given a distractor vignette and a distractor AQ27 to reduce the possibility that they may reduce the purpose of my study. They were then given the ASQ, or the Autism Stigmatization and Knowledge questionnaire, then the MCSPS, then the manipulation check, and then the demographics questionnaire. Speaking of my participant demographics, I'm only going to go through a few of these, but I had 268 participants, so I achieved more than sufficient power for my study. But my sample was overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly educated, especially in most of them, 60% of them were still enrolled in an undergraduate program. So As I mentioned before, I assessed 9 different elements of stigmatization: anger, blame, pity, dangerousness, fear, avoidance, segregation, coercion, and help. Most of these are pretty straightforward, but avoidance is the amount of social distance desired by the participant from the character. So that's whether or not you'd be comfortable having them as a lab partner, or a roommate, or sitting next to you, versus having them in your class or in the same room as you. Segregation is the amount participants agree with with isolating the character from the community, usually in a mental health institution. Coercion is the amount participants agree with forcing the character to undergo mandatory treatment, even if the character does not want to. Across all 9 of these dependent variables, the effective diagnosis label on stigma did not differ by gender. So what you're going to see next is I'm going to go through a few graphs, and they all are the same, and I just want you guys to notice that pretty much people stigmatize the character mostly very low, so I had a floor effect. So most of the values were quite low. So on the x-axis here, you'll see the conditions of diagnostic label, and then the black bar represents the non-binary character, the checkered bar represents the male character, and the stripy bar represents the female character. And on the y-axis, you'll see the range of the scale. So this is the max value that they could have put for stigmatization, and this is the least. And so for anger, there was no significant difference, and people were not very angry at the character. People did not place a lot of blame on the character for their present condition either, and as you can see, this is still quite low. People did pity the character a lot, but there was still no significant difference. The effective diagnosis label on pity did not differ by gender either. Perceived dangerousness of the character, there was also not a lot of perceived dangerousness by my participants, and the effect of diagnostic label on perceived dangerousness also did not differ by gender. Fear, kind of the same story, there was not a lot of differences. Avoidance, this is the amount that participants would like to have social contact, so this one is, the less stigmatization is a higher number. So people did not desire a lot of social distance from the character either. For segregation, people did not want to isolate the character that much from the community, and there was no difference by diagnostic label or gender. And coercion was actually kind of high compared to the other values, but there was still no difference by diagnosis label or gender. And willingness to help, people were very willing to help the character, and there was no significant difference by diagnosis label or gender. So, as I mentioned before, I used the MCSDS to assess social desirability bias, or the need for social acceptance of my sample. This is the range of the Marlowe crown. So this is the lowest value, and that's the highest value over there. And then this is the frequency, so this is the amount of participants that scored the exact score on the x-axis. 65% of my sample agreed with more than half of the items on the social desirability questionnaire. And so there was a high amount of need for social acceptance among my sample, which makes sense because they were young college students, for the most part. Additionally, the higher the score on the MCSDS was correlated with lower stigmatization. So let's get into some discussion. So in my opinion, a more sensitive and newer stigmatization measure does need to be developed. The AQ-27 is very reliable and valid and has been used since the 80s, but it's reliable and valid for a variety of types of mental disorders, and many that are more stigmatized today than level 1 ASD. In fact, many of my participants came up to me after or emailed me saying that the questionnaire seemed very harsh, and so that, I think, explains the floor effect that I saw. Additionally, I utilized like I said before, the female autism phenotype in my vignettes because my vignette characters were 22, which was novel. Most of the autism research utilizes a child-aged character, and as people with level 1 ASD age, they develop strategies that they learn to take care of their social and occupational relationships. This is called masking, and so it felt appropriate to include that behavior because the characters were older. Additionally, the intersection of stigma between gender diverse individuals and individuals on the autism spectrum has, to my knowledge, never been studied before and needs to continue to be studied, especially by someone that has access to a more diverse sample, especially with the rise of anti-trans legislation that's happening all over the country right now, and with the kind of culture war that's going on against individuals that are gender diverse. Furthermore, the misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis of females is still a huge problem, especially because the DSM-5 currently states that individuals with intellectual disability, or females on the autism spectrum are more likely to have intellectual disabilities, which is not consistent with level 1 ASD. And as I mentioned before, I had a lot of social desirability bias in my sample, indicating that the results may have been distorted. So yeah, there's a troubling gap in the literature regarding the intersection of stigma between gender diverse individuals and individuals on the spectrum. And future research both needs to address this, as well as developing a more sensitive measure that can detect nuance and microaggressive stigma towards individuals. And a special thank you to my wonderful advisor, Dr. Lisa Kezh, and to my fantastic reading committee. Thank you, Dr. Shikanda, and thank you to every professor that allowed me to collect participants from your class. Thank you to my fiance and my family and all my participants.
Thank you, Dr. Shikanda. My project is on a novel ciliary protein called FAT93, and I'm going to start by telling you all about cilia. So cilia are little organelles that stick out from the surfaces of cells. Cilia actually means eyelash in Latin, which I think is pretty fitting. They tend to look like these little eyelashes that stick out from cells. There's two main types of cilia. There's motile cilia, which are responsible for movement and cell motility. And then there's primary cilia, which play roles in signaling. And cilia are located on nearly all cells in the human body. And so just to give you some examples of ciliary function in the human body, one example you're probably all familiar with is the human sperm tail, where the sperm tail is actually a motile cilium that's required for motility, so that the sperm cell can swim to the egg for fertilization. And another example of ciliary function in the human body is in our respiratory tract. So it's pollen season, so one of the reasons why a lot of you may be coughing and sneezing is actually because of the cilia in your respiratory tract. So the cilia there help to push debris like pollen and bacteria and viruses out of your airways, so then you can then cough them out. So as you can imagine, cilia are very important, and when any of these cilia in your body aren't working properly, that can lead to a wide range of diseases known as ciliopathies. And so just to give you some examples of ciliopathies, on the previous slide I told you about the sperm tail, but cilia are also very important in the fallopian tubes. So cilia help to push the egg cells from the ovaries down the fallopian tube so that the sperm cells can then swim to the egg cells for fertilization. So if any of the cilia there aren't working properly, that can lead to infertility. And then if those cilia in your respiratory tract aren't working properly to push all those bacteria and viruses out, that can lead to some pretty debilitating chronic respiratory infections. And we also have cilia in our brain ventricles that help to move cerebral spinal fluid along. And so when those cilia aren't working properly, that can lead to a buildup of cerebral spinal fluid, which can result in hydrocephalus, which is shown in this diagram here. But to better understand these ciliopathies, we have to better understand the molecular structure of cilia. And so in this diagram here, I have the cilia, where this blue outline here is the ciliary membrane that is continuous with the cell. I like to think of the cilia as a banana, where the ciliary membrane is the peel. So if you peel away that ciliary membrane, what you're left with in the middle here is called the axoneme. And if you take a slice of the axoneme, what you'll see is that diagram on the very right. The axoneme is also referred to as the microtubule-based ciliary core. And some of you may be familiar with microtubules. These are the same types of microtubules that are found in the mitotic spindle that separate chromosomes during cell division. Microtubules are polymers of tubulin, and I'll be using tubulin as a marker for the axoneme throughout my talk. And cilia are very complex structures. There's over 700 proteins involved in this structure that are very highly organized. And I want to give you just two examples of the high complex order of the axoneme. So one example is called the 9+2 microtubule structure. And all that means is that you have 9 of these microtubule doublets that are surrounding 2 central singlet microtubules. And there's also some other structures that are involved in this process, such as radial spokes, outer binding arms, and inner binding arms. And then another example of the complex order of the axoneme is called the 96 nanometer repeat. And so what that diagram on the right is showing is essentially what's just in this red box, just flipped on its side. But you're still looking at the same structures, such as the radial spokes, the inner dining arms, and the outer dining arms. And all the 96 nanometer repeat means is that those structures repeat every 96 nanometers along the entire length of the axoneme. And so these structures are repeating every 96 nanometers. And so when you look at these structures, you would assume that the axoneme is very symmetrical, just because of how complex ordered they are. However, the axoneme is actually pretty asymmetrical. And so one structure I want to go back to tell you all about is those outer dining arms. And these outer dining arms are sticking out from those 9 microtubule doublets. So you would assume because there's 9 microtubule doublets, there would also be 9 outer dining arms. However, 1 microtubule doublet is missing an outer dining arm. So it's right here. You're good. Back one? Back one, yeah. That's okay, overall fit. Oh, okay. There's another structure that I didn't mention earlier, and they're called beaks. And they're really tiny structures that maybe only half of you in the front row can see. Here, Nick, go next. So these little tiny guys that are inside 3 of the microtubule doublets, we're still not really sure what these beaks are doing and why there's only 3 of them and not 9 of them. Additionally, there's some proteins that are localized to specific areas of the axoneme. So in this immunofluorescence on the right, the cilia are in pink, represented by tubulin, and then a protein called DHC11 is in green. So in this immunofluorescence, we can see that DHC11 is only present at the base of the cilia and not the entire length. And a lot of what we know about these axonemal asymmetries come from studies using an organism called Chlamydomonas reinhardti. And Chlamydomonas reinhardti is a single-celled green algae that has 2 cilia for motility and mating. The cilia of Chlamydomonas reinhardti are very evolutionarily conserved. So in these 2 axonemes here, one from Chlamydomonas and then one from a human sperm tail, just looking at them, you can really see the similarities between these 2 axonemes. Chlamydomonas is also very easily maintained in the lab, and we have a wide variety of mutants that we can experiment with. And wild type is just a cell type that essentially is healthy and has no mutations. And I will be using this throughout my talk to refer to cells that have no mutations. And LF5, or long flagella 5, and SHF2, or short flagella 2, are 2 ciliary length mutants that, as you can see, LF5 has really, really long cilia, and SHF2 has really, really short cilia. And so we can use mutants like LF5 and SHF2 to study things like ciliary length control. In the Alfred lab, oh, no, you're good, keep it there. In the Alfred lab, we use Chlamydomonas reinhardti to study a novel ciliary protein called FAT93. And FAT93, or flagellar-associated protein 93, is a very highly intrinsically disordered protein with some coiled coil regions. And so the predicted protein structure of FAT93 is shown here, where those coiled coil regions are in dark blue. And FAT93 is very tightly bound to the axoneme, and so what that means is if you peel away that ciliary membrane, FAT93 is still associated with the axoneme. And FAT93 is also localized to the proximal 1 micron of the axoneme. So in this immunofluorescence on the right, the cilia are represented once again in red by tubulin, and FAT93 is in teal. And so what we see is FAT93 localized to the very base of the cilia, close to the cell body. And so while we know this about FAT93, we still don't know its function. And this is largely because a FAT93 mutant that has no FAT93 has no overt phenotype. So for example, FAT93 mutant cells swim and photoaccumulate just like wild type. And photoaccumulation is just a movement towards or away from light. So in this image here, we see that both wild type cells and FAT93 mutant cells are swimming away from light. And similarly, when we calculate the swimming speeds of wild type cells and FAT93 mutant cells, what we see is they pretty much swim at the exact same speed. So from this, we can't really deduce any possible function of FAT93 from its mutant phenotype. And so one idea is that FAT93 could be associated with another protein that is localized to that same proximal end of the axoneme. And this is because, and one idea is that because proteins that are localized to the same area at the same time, it can be kind of used as like circumstantial evidence for these proteins working together in some way. And so OTA10 and BFL3 are 2 proteins that are both localized to that proximal end of the axoneme, just like FAT93. And so my research question is FAT93 associated with OTA10 or BFL3? And so one way to answer this question is to localize FAT93 in a mutant that is missing either OTA10 or missing BFL3. And so some predictions from that experiment are shown here, where once again, FAT93 is shown in teal. So I could And then the cell type is an OTA10 mutant that has no OTA10, or a VFL3 mutant that has no VFL3. And so what I could see is that FAP93 could be totally unaffected, or FAP93 could be reduced, absent entirely, or mislocalized to another part of the axoneme. And so here are the three immunofluorescences that came out of that experiment. And I want to focus on VFL3 briefly. So VFL3, or variable flagella 3, has a mutation that can, as you can see, result in 3 cilia instead of 2. But then collectively, when we look at all three of these cell types, once again, what we see is that FAP93 is still localized to that proximal end of the axoneme. However, when I looked at OTA10, I saw FAP93 looked much smaller than I had been used to seeing, especially compared to wild type and VFL3. FAP93 just looked like these 2 little tiny dots. And so I was really intrigued by this, and I wanted to actually quantify how much FAP93 was there. Next slide. And so in order to quantify how much FAP93 is present in an OTA10 mutant, first I had to isolate just those axonemes from 3 cell types. So wild type, the OTA10 mutant, and then an OTA10 rescue. And an OTA10 rescue is essentially just an OTA10 mutant that has no OTA10, but then we give it a fully functioning copy of the OTA10 gene, which rescues the phenotype. So now that cell is essentially like wild type. So to illustrate, I isolate just those axonemes, and then I perform what's called an immunoblot. And an immunoblot, or a Western blot, is a technique that's used to detect how much of a protein is present in a sample. And so what you're looking at in this top row is how much FAP93 is present in wild type, OTA10 mutants, and then OTA10 rescue axonemes. And then right below is showing how much tubulin is present in those axonemes. And so once again, what I've seen again is that FAP93 looks so much more reduced in the OTA10 mutant compared to the wild type and OTA10 rescue axonemes. And so in order to actually quantify this, I compared each FAP93 band density directly to its tubulin band. Next slide. And so the results from that are shown in this bar graph, where that relative density of FAP93 to its tubulin band is on the y-axis, and then we have the wild type, OTA10 mutant, and then the OTA10 rescue. And what we found again is that FAP93 is significantly reduced in OTA10 mutant axonemes. And so what this means is that FAP93 requires OTA10 for full and complete assembly onto the axoneme. And so in summary, cilia are necessary for so many functions of the human body. And FAP93 is a novel ciliary protein that is localized to the proximal end of the axoneme. And FAP93 requires OTA10 for full and complete assembly onto the axoneme. And lastly, I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Alford, for her mentorship, as well as Dr. Shrikande, the members of my committee, Dr. Sale, Dr. Schmeichel, and Dr. Vaughn, as well as the current and past members of the Alford Lab, Marilyn, Malika, Cassandra, and Alanis. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Like Dr. Shikande said, my name is Ashrakat Hassan, and I'm the only senior thesis department person in the politics department. I'm from Sudan. I was born in Cairo, but I'm originally from Sudan, and I've always had a tie to its heritage and culture, but not necessarily to political history. And so in 2019, when I opened my phone and I saw that the president that was around since I was around was removed from power, I was shocked, but the rest of the world was not. So I decided to dedicate the last 2 years of my degree here at Oglethorpe to finding out what happened, why it happened, and how can we prevent coups from happening again. Before we begin, I really do want to provide a moment to talk about the martyrs who passed away in a lot of these different conflicts. One of them is a close friend of one of my other friends, Muhammad Al-Baha, who was killed by the military at Ashrakat. The rest of them are either relatives of mine or distant friends, or just strangers that have been murdered in the street or pulled out of the river Nile. So I do want to provide them space to fill in with them. So my country has always had a political turmoil in terms of its history since its independence in 1956. So I always wondered, why have coups always been the common theme throughout its time? We've never had a real election, and if we did have an election, we all know how dictators kind of work out. And most of our leaders have been military men. None of them have been public affair professionals or public policy professionals. And so as a result, I always wondered, is it because of poor development? Is it because of corruption? Is it because of misallocation of resources? Or is it a little bit of both? Are there social factors? And through my research, and this is very novel because there hasn't been an analysis of 1956 to 2023 just yet, of why each coup happened and how the current coup in 2021 has occurred. So it's very interesting to see this new research kind of come out. And more importantly, be able to trace the reasons throughout Sudan's history. So these are my literature review. Here you have Dr. Armas as a cited resource. But essentially there are about 6 political variables that describe why coups happen. There are coup ceiling and coup trap, but I'll explain all these for sure. There's political participation as a variable, the development of political institutions in the country, social forces and social frustrations, the leadership style of the actual military men, and total type by one means. So what is a coup? A coup, remember this, is the transition of power by force. Sometimes it's the military, sometimes it's by people, sometimes it's the military to give it back to the people, but the main important thing is it's an infiltration of a small but critical segment of the state apparatus. So there are different types of coups. We all know the Bolshevik Revolution was a people uprising, but the coups that Sudan has are military-led coups, and they have 2 important goals. Is to limit the public participation of the upper and middle class, and to control the government from the previous institutions that were present. So we've had several veto coups throughout our history. So what are the symptoms of a coup? So we're going to diagnose de-stabilization together. The first is the coup ceiling. Ezra and France found an economic threshold that would predict the likelihood of a coup in a country. If a country makes under $500 gross net per capita a year, the likelihood increases. They found 3 countries, Sudan included, that not only had coups, but also was underneath that threshold. So as you're analyzing global movements and global struggles, when you find that economic threshold, be wary, because the coup will likely happen in that scenario. The other symptom is a coup trap. The more likely a country the more increased the relationship a country has with coups in general, with destabilization in general, the more likely it is to fall into the trap of having a coup. Stabilization takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, and it takes intention. And there's so much, it's so easy to fall into that trap of having a coup because the institutions aren't fully developed yet. So it's the more likely you see coups happen in Sudan's history, the easier it was for Sudan to fall into that coup trap. The other thing is, if you notice a lot of revenue that a country makes being poured into the military's defenses, weaponry, and training, you see the likelihood of a coup increase because the military at this point has the wherewithal and the strength to take over the country. So we see a lot more weapons coming from countries like Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which Sudan has experienced. The military was more likely to have the strength to take over Bashir's regime than we saw after the region. The other thing is, if you start seeing certain personalities in the military itself, demagogues who have thirst for power, or what we call coup-prone personalities, they're more likely to have a wherewithal to take over the coup as well. This man right here, his name is Mohamed Bello. We call him Hemekti because our former president, Ahmed al-Bashir, Hemekti means protector in Arabic, and he was his right-hand man. Because of the power that Russia, China, and UAE and Saudi Arabia kingdom provided him in terms of military weapons, but also the amount of finances that Bashir gave him, he was able to take over his best friend's regime. So be wary of all of those symptoms. In terms of the social and political aspects that kind of change things, there's a couple things. Social forces are you and me. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, religious groups, ethnic groups, status groups. Those are individuals who have some kind of wherewithal or stay in the government and how it runs. When we become frustrated at how our elections are run, which are political institutions, elections, political parties, banks, education systems, when those systems are not working in the way that they should be, and we become frustrated, uprisings occur, because social movement is very popular and we're angry. As a result, coups are more likely because of those scenarios. And remember, all of these variables have to happen at the same time. So when we became frustrated as a country in Sudan, and we saw that our political institutions weren't working or weren't working in our favor, we found that political participation increased. We organized in the streets, demonstrations were more rampant, and social forces organized each other. We have the Sudanese Professional Association, in which doctors and lawyers solely have organized to help people get involved in overturning the government system as it was, and it's because of that frustration that the coups are more likely in Sudan. Now that we know exactly what happened in terms of social symptoms in order to take over the coup, let's talk about what exactly happened before during the colonial period. When the British arrived in 1898, they were here since 1956 when we declared independence. They did something very particular in colonialism, and this is universal in the way that they run their empires. They put a lot of power among the indigenous populations in the country in terms of the military men. They give them weapons, but they also give them the mindset to protect the imperial state, not to protect us as individuals. And so yes, as we grow and generations change, the military changes. At the same time, they still have that mindset of I'm going to protect the military state and not the people that I'm serving as defense methods. And so we saw that in Sudan. As the crown had left, and mind you, they didn't leave until very much, they left the military without any kind of understanding of who their constituents were, who they were actually serving. And as a result, the military never fully saw us as they didn't really see us protectors anyway. They didn't really want to protect us in the first place. Coups are very successful depending on how people react to it. If there's low political participation, people really want to get involved with their army and demonstrations, coups are going to be successful. Coups are going to be successful and they'll be able to maintain the regime as they are. But like how we were in Sudan, when we were demonstrating in the streets, we were organizing our special forces and we were very angry, coups were very unsuccessful. The regimes don't always stay the same. So what happened in Sudan? All of it at the same time. From the first political, as each military leader took over, and I'll explain each military leader and their personality and what they did when they were in power, they all did the same thing. They made themselves supreme leader, had one political party, vested all government authority in themselves, completely crippled the economy, put an extreme amount of debt throughout. It's kind of crazy how this all worked out at the same time. And military spending was kind of put onto them as the main source of our revenue. The other thing is that they always made us angry. We were always so angry, and we tried to find ways to revolt through our political participation, but they would always put us in jail. So political prisoners were at an all-time high in multiple of these leaders' regimes in their tenure. At the same time, certain regime leaders were harsher than others. Sometimes they would do public executions, other times they would just put us in prison. Regardless, dissent was now a crime. Political debate was now illegal. So what happened after the result of all those things? We fall into the coup trap once more. Let's get into each leader. We talked about how the military in Sudan during the colonial period, which just had a mindset of protecting the British state, and even after they left, they had a mindset of protecting the status quo and not necessarily the people themselves. But there's also something else that the British did. The British had an agreement with the Egyptians called the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. And because Sudan by nature is very fertile, has very fertile land, we have the Nile River running through it, and we have so many mineral resources, they poured so much money into the development of North Sudan's roads, infrastructure, and farmland, but left South Sudan, which is one of the youngest countries in the world today, out of picture. So South Sudan, from the beginning of independence, was already at a bad start. And what happens when you're at a bad start? You get angry. Social forces in South Sudan started a civil war, as which was lack of political autonomy, lack of political development of institutions, and as lack of representation in government. So already, we're at a bad start. At the same time, though, in terms of North Sudan being developed really well, there were 13 political parties by the time we started. Within 2 years of us being officially a country that's sovereign and recognized by different nations, we had a first coup. General Ibrahim Abdul took power from the British-appointed Prime Minister Abdullah Khalid in 1957, and already we were under that threshold that I talked about. We had only made $130 US by the time per capita by the time he left in 1964, well under that crucial threshold. The political institutions, like I said, he made himself the supreme leader. He was a military man, so he didn't really know how to lead people. He knew how to lead militaries. And as a result, he jailed us. But there's also something that's very important about the patterns that I keep seeing across our history. The Islamization and Arabization of Sudan. We are African people, depending on who you ask. But we are indigenously African. At the same time, he wanted to make sure that Islam was taught in schools, that Arabic became the national language, and that the Sharia codes that are perverted in his view were made into law. So we can see this kind of be decimated as we go along in history, but he was the first beginner of that kind of mindset, that philosophy. So they were ousted because of a particular thing that he really messed up on. The Aswan Dam in Egypt was created as a moneymaker for Sudan. We needed money, and we were able to create an infrastructure in Egypt in order to make that kind of money through an agreement with the Egyptians. But what ended up happening is we displaced thousands of Nubian indigenous populations there. I'm Nubian. And as a result of that dam, a lot of our ancestors were either dried out of their farmland or completely removed from the area as a result of that construction. So the Nubians, college students, and lawyers and doctors had a full-blown strike, basically stopped the economy at that point, and removed him from power. The military, and they do this a lot, and that's why it's a veto coup, took their chance and did this. They put him in power. Deaf and Mary, which is arguably one of the harshest movements that Sudan's ever experienced, did the same thing. Crippled the economy, we're well under that threshold in terms of economic development. He officially developed Sudan's economic state, so we see Islamic state, so we see kindergartners studying the Quran at a very young age, Sharia law being codified into the government, and the Constitution, by the way, rewritten, repealed, and reinstated through his view. And we would see that repeat itself throughout history. In terms of what he did as a politician, he made his own political party, his whole political party, and ensured that the civil war that was happening in Sudan at the same time was ended for 1 year, and then started up again the next year because he got mad. In terms of political participation as well, we had a quick clash with the Ansar movement, who were the proponents of the Islamism state. And essentially, he was removed from power because of them, as well as college students, doctors, lawyers, and engineers. So remember the power that you all have and the way the governments are run. Once the military, once people had taken over that power and had that uprising, the military took charge again, and they had something called the Transitional Military Council. The TMC actually has existed today, and is a little foreshadowing because they put him in power, our first and only non-military man in power. He was an imam. So we still have that Islamization, Arabization thing going on, but at the same time, though, he was one of the few people that we really appreciated in today's collective history. But we call him Abu Kana, which means father of talk, because that's all he would do. He had a lot of economic plans, ambitious plans. Democracy was very powerful then. He was recognized by the United States for his work and efforts, but he only went for 3 years, and there's a reason for that. Food prices skyrocketed. He canceled them, but we weren't making any money because there was no development of those institutions that would develop us making money. The other thing that he would often do is that he would ensure that the debt ceiling would kind of lower out for a little bit and ask for aid, but that puts us in more debt because we weren't making any more money. So at the same time, though, the war in South Sudan was continuing, and they were getting momentum. They were pushing back the borders into the strategy. And I remember Bashir, who was the president that you guys are probably familiar with, who ran for 30 years, gave him an ultimatum. And this is what happens when you provide so much money towards the military, they can start talking to you and how they want to. They told him, either you stop the war, or we move you from power. But he couldn't deliver, and in January 1989, he was removed from power. Ahmed Bashir is known for several of his war crimes. How many are familiar with Darfur that happened in the early genocide? He was the orchestrator of that with Burhan, the guy that I mentioned earlier. As a result of the United Nations now being an investigative resource in the country, we can still continue to have an economic crisis. And South Sudan, that alone was a bunch of war crimes on in and of itself. The International Criminal Court had formally put an arrest warrant towards him as well. So we already see these kind of issues throughout his tenure. In terms of what happened in 2018, inflation, really bad prices for gas, bread, and water, the basic necessities for survival. And as a result, he stopped dissent. No more protests, no more demonstrations. In terms of political participation, in regards to the social students, professionals, we still were out in the streets protesting. And in April 11, 2019, he was removed from power. This guy was placed in power as a result by the Transitional Military Council we talked about before. He was pretty good for a little bit. Recognized by Sudan, we were awful of terrorists and rockers at that point, so we had amazing opportunities there. But there was a coup by Bashir's regime supporters that took over, and he didn't support that coup. And as a result, he was removed from power by the Burhan and Dagalo. This is Burhan, this is Dagalo. Dagalo was orchestrator of the Darfur genocide. He's one of Bashir's main men in terms of the RSF. So if you guys have seen what's going on in Sudan right now, I can answer any questions about that. But this is just a quick slide about that. And this is the social media response to what's going on in South Sudan at the moment. The biggest thing that I want you guys to remember the victims. Remember that you can really understand what's going on in terms of identifying the symptoms of the coup in and of itself, and you can predict them before they happen. I didn't know what was going on, so I can predict them before they happen. And global variables are very out in your face. They're not hidden, and these people don't know how to hide their crimes. So have some self-agency, advocate for your own countries, and remember that you have the power to change systems. Because like I said before, doctors and lawyers and students were the ones taking over the regimes. Thank you.